Before we begin this video, I want to answer a couple of popular questions that have arisen throughout the last couple of videos. First, and this one is a very popular question, can elves sleep? Yes, elves can sleep. Even though elves do not need to sleep in order to recuperate energy or rest their brain like the rest of us do, they can still do so and may even occasionally dream. That being said, it is extremely rare for an elf to sleep, as it is generally considered to be a waste of time for them, and dreams can actually be seen as scary for most of them. Through their trance, elves can manipulate their memories and replay them expertly. But through dreaming, their memories are muffled and uncontrolled, chaotic even. This feeling they very much dislike. Priests of Sehanin Moonbow are the biggest exception, as the goddess actually sends messages to her priests through dreams. So her priests, of course, sleep all the time. The second question I got the most was, how do half-elves factor in with the notion of reincarnation and closeness to the Sundering? Elves experiencing their primeval time in heaven through trance when they're children and throughout their lives, this connection to their god gets accentuated over and over again. But what about half-elves? The reality is that elves don't actually know what happens to half-elves, if they ever reincarnate or if they even go to Arvandor when they die. Since half-elves cannot trance, they cannot see if they have an elvish soul, or if they have ever reincarnated before, as normal elves can. The Sundering also completely refuse to answer these questions, possibly to avoid causing a panic in one way or another. Some elves use this mystery to fuel their xenophobia and isolationism, rationalizing that elves should stay with elves so as to avoid creating half-elves and cursing that elvish soul into being severed from Arvandor, claiming that half-elves do have the souls of real elves, but they can never reincarnate because of their non-elvish body. Other elves argue that elves were always meant to be mutable, and that adopting other shapes like those of humans or dwarves is in their nature and will make them closer to Corellon. These elves claim that the existence of half-elves is a sign of hope rather than a threat. The reality is that nobody knows whether or not a half-elf has an elvish soul, or a human soul, or another kind of soul. But now, let's talk about the most powerful high magic spells in the world. I have already mentioned many times in the past that because of the nature of how high magic works, there really isn't a limit to how powerful these spells can get. And that's not lip service either, I mean it when I say it. Let me be quite frank here. Some of these rituals of the myriad are end-of-the-world powerful. In the book where you can find these spells, it is very explicitly mentioned that none of these are ever meant to be used by players. Not just because of how difficult it would be to attune yourself to high magic, but really because of how game-changing they are. These spells are the reasons why elves are so mystical. Rituals of the myriad are high magic rituals that require 5 or more people with no real limit to how many mages can participate. Generally speaking, the more high mages that join a ritual, the more powerful the ritual will be. Though because of the nature of how difficult it is to train an elf in high magic, well, there really aren't many to be found. Typically around 12 high mages has been the most that has ever been seen together in a ritual of this magnitude. The other reason for this is because, well, many of these rituals are so powerful that they basically require the death of the casters for the spell to work. Let's start with the first one, Arn Tel Orar, Storm Erosion. Quote, by wrapping all the high mages of this casting in a near-solid ward, the high mages can weather away an entire city. Unlike the near-untamed forces of the Entel Orar ritual, these forces find any unnatural states for living and non-living matter and restore them to their most natural states. Stone buildings are reduced to the soil from whence they came, wooden buildings are reduced to seedling trees, and so on. End quote. On the last episode, we talked about the corrosion/erosion spell. The spell basically erodes everything in the area that is artificially made, like any form of stone or wood construction, and erodes it magically until it becomes soft loam. That was the spell that required 3 high mages. This, on the other hand, becomes more and more powerful the more high mages that join the ritual, effectively increasing its range per active spell caster. The effects, however, are also different, albeit subtly. The ritual of complement corrosion erosion dismantled all artificial constructs and simply turned it all into workable soil, but this spell is much more powerful, as it literally returns the components of what it is eroding back to where they came from. A wooden house dismantled by storm erosion will have the wood return back to the tree. A stone wall dismantled by storm erosion will have its stone return back into the rock from where the stone was taken. On top of all of this, the spell will naturally bless all the living plant matter in the area, revitalizing it into natural health. Quote, "Like the Lesser Entel Aura ritual, this ritual cleanses pollution by civilization and restores the natural order of the place." End quote. Do keep in mind that this would also restore the magically altered trees from Elven realms into their normal common versions. The next one we got is called Lilla Ormond, place from all around and nowhere, home of summoning. Quote, "This ritual stakes out a ritual site, and the castings of 5 high mages pull together rock and minerals or small seedlings and plants to grow a building." End quote. Back in 2nd and 3rd edition, there used to be this really fun spell called Leomund's Secure Shelter. What it did was, it basically summoned a cottage out of whatever materials were around. You could then chill on the cottage that you have just summoned, or use it as a small base or defensive option. It used to be a very powerful and fun spell, though it had some limitations. It was a 4th level spell, but it would only last for 2 hours per level of the caster, so essentially, the idea was that you would summon the cottage and then take a long rest inside. Then the house would disappear and you would go on about your business. This high magic is like an extremely overpowered version of that. This high magic spell allowed for creative construction, so you could actually choose whatever designs you would want and the spell would create it for you. This is how the elves created houses in the shapes of waves, monstrous spiders, and really any strange or nonsensical configuration. The beauty of it is that it didn't matter the shape or design of the construction. The magics of the spell made the edifice work and actually stand. Even if you had built an entire house on top of a tiny pinprick, the house would stand as the weave would simply make it work. In Skullport, in Dungeon of the Mad Mage, there is a massive spider-shaped mansion on the ceiling of the cavern. The house is basically upside down in the shape of a spider on the ceiling, and I had my players wondering how something like that was even remotely possible. Well, this is how you make that possible. The construction can also mold itself and use its surroundings as materials, which is how elves can actually construct houses right smack in the middle of trees. You might think this is a very silly ritual of the myriad, especially when I just spent a couple of minutes talking about how some of these spells are world-ending, and hey, that might be true, at least until you realize that the constructions that you summon through this high magic don't actually have to be houses. This process can be adapted to create almost any kind of construction. In fact, it is through this ritual that the elves actually designed and constructed their impossibly enormous armadas of space monarch ships. Designs that would literally be impossible to build otherwise. Yes, the entire space force of the Elvish Empire was created with this spell. Okay, now let's brace ourselves. We are getting into the really good stuff. Anquor Caor, the banishing, binding outside of the people's lands. Quote, "Just as the Gatil ritual allows high mages to create a spatial vortex between 2 points, a gate, this great ritual of at least 9 high mages both summons a physical form of an extraplanar entity, such as a Tanari Lord or a godly avatar, and then binds it, setting certain limitations upon the target entity. In its least form, this ritual banishes the entity temporarily from the realms, while the most advanced forms of this ritual fully banishes the entity permanently from realm space and confines said physical avatar in a sub-dimensional prison. All levels of binding must have one way to undo the binding set by the High Mages." End quote. This, and I want you guys to absorb this, this spell might very well be the only spell in the world that cannot ever be broken, not even by a god. The only entities that could break this spell are Mystra, obviously, being the overall goddess of magic, Corellon being the god of high magic, and lastly what they call the Overpower Ao, which is the god of all the gods. Other than these three entities, no one can break the seal that banishes this powerful entity. Not a dispel cast at a 12th level will break it, not a wish spell will break it, not even a high magic ritual of the myriad cast with 20 high mages will break this seal. The bindings are irrefutably unbreakable and immune to all magic. The entity will be trapped in a prison subdimension and its influence will be completely banished and removed from the world. Hence, if this spell is ever used against a god, all of that god's paladins and clerics would lose their powers. Typically what happens when you lose your connection to your god is you merely cannot regain your spell slots, but whatever slots and spells that you currently have, you can still use until of course you run out of them. Quote, "There must always be a way to unlock the binding ritual, and the binding must be released at the exact site, not by far away magics. Given the cost of a binding, it is understandable that the elves make the keys nigh impossible stipulations. For example, dissolving a bind through the efforts of a non-born child, by moisturing with the tears of Kusith, the lord of elemental fire, or via spells cast by a human son of a dwarf or elf." End quote. Because there must always be a way to unlock the bind on this god that you have imprisoned, what you end up inadvertently creating is a literal prophecy. For example, if you bind the evil dark dragon Alduin with this spell and you set the key to something like, "As long as any of the kingdoms of this land stand, this banishment will last," then you will be creating a prophecy like that of Skyrim. This is a really scary spell because through it, you could trap and banish virtually any power, demigod or full-blown god. You could literally just summon Lathander, the Morning Lord, and just banish him forever with this spell. He would literally be incapable of stopping you. The trick though, and what makes this not a spell to be trifling with, is that every single high mage that takes part in the casting will die in the process, as the bonds that bind the god will be made via the literal life essence of the high mages. Most often than not, however, it's not just the high mages that get killed, but many of the supporting members as well, as a lot of life force is needed if you wish to entrap really powerful entities. You need at least 400 hit points worth of members dying in the casting to imprison any lesser extraplanar of any kind, or an agent of a god like a powerful angel, and you would need at least 800 hit points to imprison a demigod. For a lesser god, that being a god that has around 1,000 to a couple of tens of thousands of followers, you would need around 1,200 hit points worth of members slain in the ritual. For an intermediate god, which would be one that holds over 100,000 followers, you would need around 1,600 hit points. And lastly, for a greater god, a god boasting millions of followers, you would need around 2,000 hit points. Quite obviously, the high mages will not have the necessary hit points to be able to use their life force alone to bind these greater powers, so you will usually see many non-casters that will participate in the ritual in order to offer their life for the binding to work. The hit points will always be drained from the high mages first, so regardless of how many sacrifices are ushered, it will never spare the casters. Quote, "This ritual has been used historically in the imprisonment of the essence of the rotting god Meander, both at Darkwatch and beneath his fallen temple. Legends say that a variant of this ritual performed by Corellon and his priests alongside the high mages banished the drow from the surface lands. This idea is dubious as their imprisonment is lax, though many believe their reduced power in sunlight is the nature of the binding." End quote. The last major spell that we have for the rituals of the myriad is called Uaul Selu Kerith, the Sundering, at war with the weave. Quote, "Used only during situations most dire, 12 high mages can harness the energy of the weave to cause it to fluctuate across a great distance. In lesser ritual forms, the Uaul ritual disrupts all magic for miles around and causes great turmoil in weather and animal life. Thunderstorms, earthquakes, dead magic, animal stampedes, and tornadoes are common. In this ultimate form, the weave is temporarily torn asunder, and the damage is made manifest in major cataclysms and storms, tidal waves, and permanent changes to the lands of any planet." End quote. If the weave is water, this high magic is the equivalent of doing this. This is the spell that was used in the creation of Evermeet, the massive island mass that is now the permanent home of the elves. Essentially what they did is they used this spell to break apart the world. They wanted to turn what was essentially a Pangea scenario into multiple landmasses so that they could have their solitary big island. The spell has only been used once, and at this point there's really only two people in the world that know the workings of the spell. One is the Srinshi, an elvish Belnorn, and the other is unknown. We're not actually told who the other person is. Now, as you can imagine, there are multiple high magics that have been completely lost, whether it is because the only high mage that knew the spell died, or because the elves purposefully decided to forget them because they were too dangerous. A harpist used to be able to play a harp and walk on the path of the melody, creating a road that led to other worlds. A high mage in the past, given great cost, could turn lakes into dust bowls and set the very air around him on fire. High mages of the past could shatter godly avatars by speaking the true name of that god in a ritual with intonations that could disconnect the god from the weave. But of course, one of the most important and powerful rituals was the one that they called Mornhaur Sai Kelor, the Killing Storm. The exact nature of the ritual is now forgotten, but the High Moor is evidence of what it mustered, and many elvish scholars point to the Moor as evidence enough that the ritual should simply be forgotten and never unearthed. It is particularly interesting that the lore actually states that elves actually go out of their way to make sure that other races do not interfere and do not attempt to learn the nature of that spell, even if they wouldn't be able to cast high magic. It is not impossible, of course, for these spells to be replicated via normal level magic, especially during the time of Netheril before the ban of any spell higher than 9th level. In fact, during those days when the humans could cast 11th level spells, whenever the elves got even just a tiny hint that mages, human mages, were attempting to learn about Killing Storm, those mages would be found dead within a week, and their books and notes on the subject would be found destroyed. In fact, this happened over 7 times just during the times of Netheril alone. Quote, "The elves have diligently guarded against anyone using this magic or a variant of it since the end of the Third Crown War, and no elf would dare resurrect the greatest of sacrileges." End quote. Alright guys, thank you so much for sticking through with all of these videos. We really did a number on the elves. We covered so much about them, and it's funny because the reason why I wanted to cover them in the first place was to talk about spells. We were, of course, in the middle of talking about 10th and 11th and 12th level spells, and well, I mean, how can you talk about high level magic when, you know, without covering high magic, without covering the elvish high magic, which is basically on the same level as 12 level spells. So we kind of had to do it, but it's over. We're done. We've covered everything that there is to cover on this subject. There is still some other stuff that, we were just kind of done here. So up next, I suppose, is just Spelljammer. We're going to talk about Spelljammer, and then once we're done with that, we'll probably return to talking about monsters, because there's, of course, a lot of monsters to cover. But in the meantime, I would like to personally thank my Patreon supporters: Zach Bowell, Mediocre at Best, Rukato Fan, Barry Maskant, 5E Magic Shop, Daniel Umar, Dr. Cowbell, Rusty Rain, Morgan Johnson, Skitsya Boy, Biotechnofrag, Daniel Luna, Kush Bane, Duck Feeder, Brad Salazar, The Great Codini, Alyssa Rossell, Major Fail Gaming, Terry Culp, and Morgan McCormick for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you would like to support me as well, then please head on over to patreon.com/MrRex to support. Guys, make sure that you go and click on the playlist button that I always leave at the end of all of my videos and check out the other ones. If you like these videos, I promise you're going to enjoy the other ones. They're all as good. So just go in there and have a blast. But anyways, I will see you all on the next one. Bye-bye, guys.